good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn or refresh your memories about industrial stormwater regulations. My name is Tanya Schramm. I'm the Civil Division Manager at Summit Engineering. And a little bit about Summit, for those of you who haven't heard, we were founded in 1978, and we are a multidiscipline firm offering civil, structural, electrical, water, wastewater, and planning services for Northern California. Our goals for today are to teach you something new, refresh your memories, provide clarity around the code and requirements, or help answer your questions. So joining me in giving this presentation are Sarah Stern and Andrew Willis, both in our civil division, and kudos to Kat Maravich, who's behind the scenes making sure our presentation runs smoothly. Okay, so a few ground rules to share. Participants are muted to minimize interruptions so our presentation runs smoothly. But feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the presentation. We'll go through the questions at the end. If you have questions after the presentation and or something specific you would like us to help you with, please email me and I'll get back to you after the presentation. Lastly, the presentation will be recorded and sent to all attendees. All right, moving on to the agenda. So today we are going to cover the Industrial General Permit, or IGP. And I'm going to say that moving on because there's so many words that are complicated and all that, and will trip me up. So I'm going to switch over to acronyms moving forward. Okay, so we're going to talk about how the IGP applies to wineries. We'll talk through the Industrial Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, another mouthful, so ISWIP, components and process to develop one, a monitoring implementation plan, or MIP, and sampling, exceedances, third-party lawsuits, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. Okay, the IGP. So it regulates industrial stormwater discharges and authorized non-stormwater discharges from facilities in California. So the IGP is called a general permit because many types of industrial facilities are covered by the same permit. The State Water Resources Control Board and Regional Water Quality Control Board, I'm going to call that the state or the water boards, implement and enforce the IGP. So the goal of the IGP is to reduce the pollutants carried by stormwater and transported into bodies of water. The regulation provides a consistent practice and requirements for monitoring and reporting. So if exceedances occur, facilities can make adjustments necessary to comply the code. Okay, so who must apply for IGP coverage? Facilities directly related to manufacturing, processing, or raw materials storage that have stormwater commingle with industrial activity. The IGP regulates discharges associated with 9 federally defined categories of industrial activity, such as manufacturing, which includes wineries, hazardous waste facilities, landfills, recycling, and others. The types of industrial activities which require coverage are listed in Attachment A in the permit document. Okay, we're going to keep rolling with the acronyms and for the rest of the presentation. So the IGP defines the various roles involved with each facility and application. So the discharger is pretty straightforward. No acronym for that one. It's the facility. The legally responsible person, or the LRP, and is the owner in a sole proprietorship. And a corporation, it's someone who can make a legally binding agreement and commitment for the company. So the state will accept a president, secretary, treasurer, or vice president of the corporation in charge of a principal business function. The LRP is required to establish a login to SMARTS, which is the Stormwater Multiple Application and Report Tracking System. It's basically just the state's online tracking system where everything is uploaded and approved and all of that good stuff. So a note of caution, the system is a little clunky and not always intuitive or smart, really, but we can help you navigate if needed. The LRP then executes the legal agreement with the water board at the initial submittal of the stormwater plan. And they may also assign or delegate a duly authorized representative, DAR, or a data submitter for the facility on SMARTS. So moving on to the duly authorized representative, or DAR, it's someone who has responsibility for the overall operation of the facility. It could be a general manager, facility manager, superintendent, or someone who oversees all environmental matters for the company or the facility. The DAR can certify and submit all other documents on behalf of the LRP. So who can't be an LRP or a DAR? So third-party consultants like us, contractors or subcontractors cannot take on LRP or DAR responsibilities. Now, the data submitter is a consultant or someone from the facility who can upload data to smarts. The data that is uploaded then needs to be approved and certified by the LRP or the DAR before it is reviewed by the water board. And so once that all happens, the review generally takes about 1 to 2 weeks after certification, the review by the state. The IGP allows facilities to develop initial documents and submit plans on their own. However, some facilities opt to hire consultants like us to prepare plans and site maps for submittal. Lastly, but not least, is the Qualified Industrial SWPPP Practitioner, the QISP. So it's typically a consultant. If there is an exceedance at the facility, a QISP is required to assist in bringing the facility back into compliance. So who is qualified to be a QISP? It's someone who either has passed the approved QISP training or has a professional license like a PE license.
Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about paths to obtaining regulatory coverage for your facility. First, we have the most common type of coverage, and that's standard enrollment. This is the standard ISWP and monitoring that we all know and love. This means that you have areas at your facility where there is potential for stormwater to commingle with process waste or other industrial materials. Most of this presentation will follow the process of a standard enrollment because that's the most common. For a non-exposure certification or an NEC, these are facilities where industrial materials are not exposed to stormwater, and stormwater meaning all rain, snow, snow melt, runoff, anything like that. These facilities have all of their industrial activities covered by storm-resistant shelters. These include completely roofed and walled buildings or structures with only a top cover supported by permanent supports. So that could be a canopy, that could be a building with walls, etc., but everything must be covered. If you have a canopy situation where the walls are open, you need to make sure that the materials stored inside are not subject to wind dispersion or come in contact with any runoff. What is not an NEC is any facility that has any kind of diversion valves or any facility that has any outdoor uncovered tanks, crush, or receiving areas. The benefit of this type of coverage is that you avoid all monitoring and the need to develop a SWPPP. You do have to keep up with recertifying your NEC, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. The next one we have is a notice of non-applicability, and these are facilities where no water leaves the site. These are limited to sites with a designated feature to catch all runoff and detain it, typically a pond. That feature must be able to contain maximum historical daily, weekly, monthly, and annual storm events. We've seen wineries that have all drains that go to ponds, as mentioned, and this requires a technical report by a California licensed engineer showing that these ponds have capacity for those storms. Next, we have compliance groups. These are groups that want to streamline their permit coverage. They could be established for an owner with multiple facilities, or they could be grouped between multiple owners. The benefit of this is that your monitoring reduces from 4 times per year to 2 times per year. The dischargers in a compliance group do have to be in the same industry and they have to have the same SIC code. And they will also need to appoint a compliance group leader, and that person needs to be a licensed QISP trainer of record or TOR. Going through the process for enrollment, there are initial documents that go in with your application and then ongoing documents that have to be kept up with annually or as needed. So for standard enrollment, your initial documents that go in with your notice of intent or your NOI are the signed certification statement, a site map of your facility, the SWPPP itself, and a fee. And in terms of ongoing documentation, you have your stormwater sampling and monitoring that happens as needed, your annual compliance evaluation, and you just need to provide the date of that in your annual report, the annual report itself, any updates to your SWPPP and sitemap as needed, and that might be updates to operations or updates to personnel, anything like that as applicable, and your annual fee. So for the NEC, non-exposure, you will want to submit initially your NEC form and checklist along with a site map that demonstrates that your site meets these requirements and pay the initial fee. From there, the water board does require that you annually recertify the NEC, so it's not a one and done. This used to be every 5 years, but they've upped it to once a year. So make sure that you're doing that if you initially filed. Not listed here as it's a little less common, but the NONA or the Notice of Non-Applicability does also get submitted to SMARTS with the technical report that I mentioned before. The majority of the remaining presentation does refer to the standard enrollment. One question we get a lot is what to do in the case of a change in ownership for a facility. So overall, ISWP coverage is not transferable. So when a new owner takes over a facility, the previous owner has to terminate their coverage and the new owner has to obtain their own coverage. So the previous owner is responsible to first notify the new owner of their incoming responsibility to obtain new coverage. And then from there, they'll want to submit the notice of termination within 30 days following the sale. With this notice of termination, you do have to submit all of your annual reports, any outstanding documentation, etc. And then the responsibility transfers over to the new owner or the buyer. If they don't already have a Smarts account or haven't interacted with Smarts for another reason before, they'll want to start by creating their own Smarts account. After that, a new ISWP would then need to be created for the facility, incorporating any new operations, staff, etc., that differ from the previous owner. So the previous ISWP can be used as a starting point, but a lot of points in that ISWP will change just because ownership has changed, operations may change, personnel responsible for implementing BMPs may change. That document would then be submitted as a new, fresh NOI with the water board, and this whole process for the new owner should be completed as soon as possible after obtaining ownership, preferably at least 7 days before industrial activities begin at the facility. I know in some cases operations don't necessarily pause between changes in ownership, so you want to make sure that you're on top of that as soon as you take ownership of the facility. So going more into how this applies to wineries and activities typically performed at wineries, because those are the majority of ISWPs we see out here. The typical outdoor industrial activities at wineries that would qualify for them needing an ISWP include the loading and unloading of juice or wine, any crushing and pressing of grapes, washing of machinery, tanks, bins, barrels, chemical and equipment storage, facility maintenance, and garbage and recycling storage and disposal. So stormwater discharges come from the commingling of runoff in these areas where these activities are occurring. So that can be from any diversion valves, or it could be from flows or run on through these areas. There are a lot of ways that happens, but any mingling of stormwater and process water counts towards this. We'd also like to note that diversion valves are not permitted for new construction in Napa County, and existing manual diversion must be removed. Sonoma County is a little bit different. For projects requiring a use permit, Sonoma County usually issues a condition of approval prohibiting the uses of diversion valves anywhere, new or existing. So that can be an undertaking if you're planning on getting a use permit for your facility. For standard building permit projects, Sonoma County doesn't have any specific regulations preventing diversion valves, but they do advise against them. So the state and the industrial general permit don't actually prohibit outdoor winery functions, but we do want to note that during the permitting process, both counties will be wanting to minimize outdoor areas, and they will require work areas to be covered whenever possible. For that reason, when you're planning improvements at your facility, we do recommend wineries and industrial facilities to plan for stormwater compliance with your improvements and your infrastructure. So that might mean maximizing the coverage of your industrial activities with roofs and permanent storm-resistant shelters. You want to plan your site grading to isolate these industrial activity areas and eliminate any run-on to these areas. And you want to install easy to sample monitoring locations. So as far as the materials that pose a risk to stormwater that typically come from these activities, we see contents like grape waste and pomace, grape juice or wine, caustics, sodium percarbonate, and glycol. Whenever possible, it's best to keep and handle these materials indoors to reduce risk of contamination and reduce kind of the scope of your ISWP and how much you're expected to monitor. So before we get into this slide, I do want to make sure that we highlight that an ISWP or an industrial SWP is not the same thing as a CSWP or a construction stormwater pollution prevention plan. So CSWPs are separate from ISWPs, and they deal with temporary construction projects that focus on managing erosion and sediment from land disturbance, while industrial SWPs are continuous and they manage ongoing pollution from industrial sources. So the names are similar and we often get them a little bit confused, or facilities we worked with get them a little bit confused. We want to make sure that we highlight that they are separate documents. For the components of an ISWIP that the water board is looking for, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are kind of the main bullets. You have your facility name and contact information, significant industrial materials that want to be monitored on the site, description and assessment of potential pollutant sources, your minimum and advanced best management practices or BMPs, a monitoring implementation plan or MIP, the effective dates of your SWIP. So this just means if, production's not slated to start until months after you've submitted your ISWIP, you want to provide those dates to make sure you're not having to monitor more than you're required to. Also, if you plan on pausing your ISWIP for a portion of the year during the holidays or something like that, and production is going to stop completely, these are all things you want to consider in your report. And then a site map of the facility. So as far as the process of compiling an ISWIP report and what that looks like for a facility, um, this typically follows this framework. Obviously, it can look a little bit different, but usually, initially, everyone will conduct a site visit, and that will be the consultant or in-house personnel that are writing your SWIP and the project team and facility team who are working on site and can speak to what materials are stored where and what production is happening where. After that, there will be a phase of gathering info needs and facility information. That's personnel who are in charge of certain tasks on site and any additional materials that were not observed during the site visit. After that, you'll draft the report or someone will draft the report and prepare the site map. At that point, it's a good point to stop and review the ISWIP with all the stakeholders, make sure everything's accurate. And once everyone's happy with the report, you'll gather your signatures, upload it to Smarts, and hopefully have it approved by the water board. That typically takes 1-ish week for them to issue a WDID, but that can definitely look different depending how busy the water board is. So definitely plan for that in your timelines. Another note I'd like to make is that these SWIPs should be accessible on site. Electronically is fine. We're moving away from paper copies, but you'll want to make sure that someone on site is keeping all of your documentation together and on hand. We always like to say that the SWIP is a living document. So as things change at your facility and significant changes happening to monitoring and operations, you want to make sure you're marking up your ISWIP and keeping track of those changes. And once you find that your ISWIP differs significantly from your initial representation of your operations to Smarts, you'll want to make sure that you upload a change of information to make sure that your SWIP is up to date.
All right, let me spend a little time elaborating on both minimum best management practices and advanced best management practices, BMPs, here momentarily. Minimum BMPs are generally standard operating procedures for a winery or whatever industrial facility, and often have a lower cost associated with them. Here, what we're showing here is a list of what you would, generally speaking, find in the IGP. Good housekeeping, for example, sweeping or cleaning up dust and debris, keeping stormwater separated from industrial materials. Preventative maintenance, for example, replacing damaged containers, tanks, look for leaking equipment, spill and leak prevention and response, store materials in a container so that if a spill occurs, it will not contaminate stormwater. Materials handling, get solid waste to receptacles, make sure they're covered, they don't come into contact, or at least the material doesn't come into contact with stormwater. Erosion and sediment controls, this would be installation of storm straw wattles, hydro seeding to reduce erosion and prevent sediment transport. So the next category here is advanced best management practices. Advanced BMPs are generally active systems that physically modify, treat, or isolate stormwater. So the differential here is it's more of a permanent feature, certainly have a higher cost typically associated with them. And there's a laundry list of different advanced BMPs. So just providing a couple examples, a couple categories here: containment and isolation BMPs. Two examples of containment and isolation BMPs would be, or could be, permanent covered work areas, intended to prevent rainfall contact with high-risk areas such as crush pads, filter cake areas, chemical storage zones. Another one might be a bermed or curb-separated process pad. The intended purpose is to isolate processed water from stormwater. Another category of advanced BMPs could be a filtration type system, sediment removal system, such as modular media filtration units intended to remove suspended solids, oils, nutrients from stormwater via media cartridges, sort of like a sand filtration system. And then another common filtration and sediment removal system could be a biofiltration or bioretention basin. They're intended to treat runoff using soil, sand, and plant root zones for filtration and pollutant uptake. So this slide is really reflective of a typical site plan that you would incorporate in your ISWP, associated with industrial activities and intended to be a graphical depiction of industrial activities for the viewer, whether that be the local agency, state agency, or design sampler, designated sampler, excuse me. So just some minimum requirements to be shown on this plan would be you want to show property lines, you want to show certainly location of all industrial activities, and then the drainage areas that come into contact with the industrial activities. We often show, or certainly want to show, conveyance systems, surface drainage, storm drains, septic lines, process waste lines, all of equal importance. And then your discharge points, because your discharge points are often the actual sampling locations. So this is just examples of really one specific BMP, which would be a bioretention facility. We often spec these out for multiple projects. So on the left-hand side is a constructed BMP on surface level, obviously. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is a graphical section of the BMP showing you the bioretention soil that's typically intended to treat stormwater, and the section below would be the gravel bed, which would be intended for volume retention of that stormwater.
Okay, so getting a little bit more into some of the contents of the ISWP. The next one we're going to talk about is a monitoring implementation plan, or MIP. This refers to a subsection of the ISWP report document that basically details all of the monitoring processes and procedures for a facility. So someone should be able to look at this and get a full picture of how to monitor your facility, where to monitor, what to do in the case of certain events, etc. So generally speaking, the framework of the MIP follows who will do what at the facility, how rain events are going to be tracked, visual observations that are required at the facility and where those should be made, response procedures to a spill or other incident, sample collection procedures, and training. A little bit more on training, because that is kind of an umbrella term. For baseline sites, training is performed by someone familiar with the ISWP and monitoring. So that is your base requirement. That can be facility personnel, but sometimes that's an external consultant if you don't have someone in-house who can kind of train on those documents and monitoring purposes. For baseline sites, for level 1 and level 2 sites that have moved up after an exceedance, you've been upgraded to a higher level of monitoring, so you will need a QISP to conduct your training, which is typically an external consultant. So here's a graphic that kind of shows the calendar year and water year and when sampling and inspections are required. At a glance, you need 2 samples in each half of the monitoring year, as well as monthly visual inspections. So forms for these monthly visual inspections are provided with your ISWP document and should be filled out and saved with your SWP records. You'll also want to perform a visual inspection at the time of each sampling event. One of these monthly inspections should be expanded to cover an annual comprehensive facility evaluation. This basically covers the same contents as a monthly visual inspection, but it's expanded to also check for all SWP-related documentation and record keeping, etc. I'd also like to note that compliance group participants only need 1 sample in the first half and 1 sample in the second half of the water year. If you can't collect your samples, or if your site does not end up discharging any water, you just need to document. So that's okay. That's that's not prohibited under the ISWP, but you do want to make sure that you report that in your annual report and keep a record of the dates that these occurred and potential photo footage as well. If sampling does take place, the sampling data must be submitted within 30 days of receiving your results. So in terms of what makes a qualifying storm event, as these are what we're required to sample, the keys of a qualifying storm event are that they're followed by 48 hours of no discharge, and that they produce discharge for at least one drainage area at your facility. So again, if you don't have enough flow to sample, you are not expected to report a sample, as that was not a qualifying storm event. So if you don't have enough samples, you don't have your 2 samples in the first half of the year or the second half of the year, inadequate discharge is an acceptable reason to not have all of your required samples reported on the annual report. But again, you should have that documentation ready to say why you did not have your 2 required samples. So in terms of sampling protocols, samples should be collected during facility operating hours within 4 hours of the start of a discharge, or at the start of operating hours if the rain event is still occurring or occurred in the previous 12 hours. I know that's a mouthful, so we've come up with a few kind of graphic scenarios to show how this works. The first scenario, scenario 1, if a storm becomes a qualifying event before work hours, but has occurred within the past 12 hours, you will sample at the beginning of your work hours. If a storm, in the second scenario, if a storm becomes a qualifying event during your workday, you'll want to sample within the first 4 hours of discharge from that site. So as soon as you see water flowing off the site, you have 4 hours to get your samples. For the third scenario, if a storm event has not become a qualifying event by the end of work hours, you don't need to sample that unless it is still discharging the next morning when work hours begin. So I won't go too into detail on sampling techniques, because there are a lot of great tutorials out there, but in general, you do want a representative sample. So a good rule of thumb is that you don't want the dirtiest water leaving your site, and you don't necessarily want the cleanest either. So you want to collect a representative sample and be mindful of stirring up sediment when you're collecting samples, as that won't be a representative sample for the average water leaving a facility. You only want to analyze for the required constituents at your facility, so you don't want to give the water board any more, and you don't want to give them any less. And you only want to sample your industrial areas. So sometimes samples are collected in areas that are not necessarily representative of where industrial activities are happening. You want to make sure that you isolate these areas best you can with your samples to make sure you're not getting false responses from other areas. Lastly, you want to make sure that you calibrate your pH meter before every sampling event if you are using a pH meter. A little bit more about that. You do want to take the measurement preferably immediately upon getting the sample, but at least within 15 minutes, as pH starts to change with time and it does degrade. So you want to make sure that you're getting that, because we have seen false exceedances caused by waiting to take a pH sample. Some baseline sites can also use wide range litmus pH paper or an equivalent test kit for testing pH in lieu of a pH meter if they have not had 2 or more results outside of the allowable range. With that said, we'd like to add that paper or test kits only provide a rough estimate of a sample's pH. With a meter, you do have the advantage of accuracy to the first or second decimal place, so that's something to keep in mind. If your facility is level 1 or level 2, you'll need to start using a pH meter, and that is required in the IGP. We'll circulate this after the presentation, but I've linked a California Water Board sampling video at the bottom of this slide. This has a lot of helpful information on how to sample, what to do in certain sampling scenarios, and what exactly the water board is looking for when we sample. We definitely recommend showing this to sampling personnel as a training exercise.
Cool. So I'm going to restart the slide from the start. We typically see people sampling for pH, TSS, or total suspended solids, and oil and grease. Anything outside of this would depend on your receiving body of water and whether it's compromised for certain pollutants or in the chemicals present on site. So there are 2 types of NALs on this slide, and NALs are called numeric action levels, and these are what lead you to an exceedance. So you have annual maximum NALs and instantaneous maximum NALs. In annual max NAL, an exceedance occurs if the average of all of your sampling results for a parameter within the reporting year exceeds your annual max NAL. I'd like to note that this is only required for total suspended solids, or TSS, and oil and grease. pH is not regulated by this requirement. So this NAL is intended to capture, it's intended to target general or persistent issues at a facility that lead to elevated pollutant levels over time. For instantaneous NALs, these are a little bit more straightforward and you don't have to remember to go back and check them at the end of your reporting year. These exceedances occur if 2 or more individual sampling results for a parameter in a single reporting year exceed the NAL. So this requirement only applies to pH, TSS, and oil and grease, and not other parameters outside of these standard 3. So any 2 individual samples that exceed the instantaneous max NAL within the same reporting year will trigger an exceedance. So it's not 1 sample, but it does happen whenever you have 2 samples. So some people see 1 and they think, oh, I have an exceedance, but you do need to wait for that second result. This NAL is meant to catch any incidents resulting in a sudden spike in pollutant levels.
Okay, Sarah did a great job in the previous slide explaining what triggers exceedances. So when there is an exceedance, the code allows for the facility to make adjustments to get back into compliance. It isn't intended to penalize facilities when they have exceedances. So let's just take a tour through the exceedance path on the slide so you can see the potential iterative nature of the process. So everyone starts at the baseline. If there is an exceedance, the status changes to level 1. A QISP is brought on board to conduct an evaluation to identify pollutants and prepare an exceedance response action or ERA report. An action plan is prepared and implemented with corrective measures. So after 4 samples with no exceedances, status goes back to baseline. Okay, so let's say though that there is another exceedance with the same parameter, then the status changes to level 2. A QISP then conducts a more detailed assessment of the issue and prepares a technical report. The technical report includes source investigation findings, advanced BMPs or structural improvements, implementation schedules, and effectiveness evaluation of the BMPs. So between levels 1 and 2, energy and effort is ramped up to figure out what the issue is and try to troubleshoot that. So same as before, after the 4 samples with no exceedances, then the facility returns back to the baseline. If the issue is still unresolved, then you remain at level 2 and continue to troubleshoot the issue until resolved. So when you move from baseline to level 1 or 2 status, you change levels at the start of the following reporting year. And then the exceedance classification is by constituent, pH, TSS, et cetera, for the given facility, not for the facility as a whole. So in other words, you could be at level 1 or 2 for different constituents. Okay, so on to third-party lawsuits. So we have seen an increase in the frequency of wineries targeted by environmental advocacy groups. Facilities will typically receive letters accusing them of violation, sometimes including a threatening dollar value of the amount a facility could be subject to owe if they went to court. These may be based on hypothetical max daily penalties for contaminated discharge. And for someone who has never enrolled, the groups may calculate daily penalties going back to when the permit was enacted and come up with a ridiculously high number. So their objective is to negotiate for the facility to update their SWIP and sampling practices to improve water quality and to commit to sending information directly to them. A settlement dollar value is typically agreed upon, and they usually commit to not target that facility again for a period of time. It's important for everyone to note that the SMARTS website is an easily searchable source for anyone to check compliance, such as facilities that miss reporting, facilities who never enrolled in the first place, which means that these groups are cross-checking other winery databases with the SMARTS database. And when an exceedance has been reported, but no ERA prepared or submitted. Our recommendation is simple. Meet the reporting requirements and the deadlines to steer clear of the third-party involvement. But if this ever happens to you or a facility you know of, our office and a number of legal firms around the area are developing experience responding to these alleged violations. Feel free to reach out if you have questions or need support.
All right, this portion of our presentation is intended for questions. I do not see any questions that might have come through. What's Andrew Willis's favorite food category? That would be tacos. Good question, tacos. Otherwise, we have a bunch of questions that we typically hear. Some of them will be redundant, but I do think that they are important to go over once again. If they're redundant, just as well. Which type of winery operations typically require coverage under the IGP? Crushing and fermentation areas where juice or wash water can contact stormwater, barrel washing and bottling facilities with outdoor equipment storage or drainage, outdoor waste or byproduct storage, outdoor chemical storage, vehicle and equipment maintenance or washing areas, and tank farms or loading unloading zones exposed to, key words here, exposed to precipitation. Another question, and again, I think that we covered this previously, but it is important. Wineries that may be exempt from the IGP coverage. All industrial activities and materials are completely indoors, and stormwater cannot come into contact with them. Otherwise, the winery does not discharge stormwater off-site. For example, fully contained process water systems or via infiltration basins. And if a site qualifies for a non-exposure certification. Let's see what other good questions we might have. We did go over this again. Who typically develops, certifies, and maintains the ISWP, the LRP, legally responsible person, that is an owner, CEO, or authorized executive, the QISP, certified professional, often PE or environmental consultant, generally in charge of technical preparation, sampling, preparation of ER reports, drafting up the SWIP, site mapping, even BMP design. And then you've got your stormwater team, which can be on-site staff, winery staff, and those folks would implement BMPs, perform inspections, and sample. Let's see here. How often should wineries review and update their ISWP? The recommendation is at least once per year during the annual compliance evaluation. So the time frame typically is prior to the rain season. Recommendation generally is between the months of August and October. You'd want to confirm that your site operations, materials, drainage systems are accurately reflected. Nothing has changed. If something has changed, there's reason to update your ISWP. You want to check to be sure that all BMPs are functioning effectively. Is there any reason to change your monitoring plan? Have sampling points change for one reason or another? Are the same pollutants, is there any change? Is there any additional pollutants that might need to be sampled? And then employee training is important. And stormwater team contacts also need to be kept up to date. One last question I guess I'll go over is what are the key analytic parameters typically monitored? We have gone over this. The three main and most important that need to be sampled and monitored for would be pH, TSS, total suspended solids, and oil and greases. Other ones that we see with wineries could be nitrate, nitrites, BOD, biochemical, oxygen demand, and if any other questions do come up, please feel free and reach out to us. Otherwise, I'll hand this off to Tanya.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. We hope the information we shared was valuable to you. For further questions, feel free to reach out to me or anyone here at Summit, and my email address is on the slide. And a reminder that the recording and slides will be made available to everyone who RSVP'd and attended. That we'll end the presentation. Thanks, everybody.